Good morning, my brothers and sisters. Welcome to episode number 30 in the book of Genesis. I'm going to ask a question today about the fall, about the curse. And the question is, when did God know? Specifically, what did God know when he walked in the garden of the cool of the day? That's the first question I was thinking about. So let me just take us back. We've already done all of Genesis chapter 3. We're ready to move on to chapter 4, theoretically. And I want to ask another question about the fall chapter, which is all of Genesis 3. Genesis 3:6. I'll just start there. She took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. Verse 8, 3:8. And they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and the man and his wife hid themselves. So my question is, what did God know when he walked in the garden in the cool of the day? And when did he know that his son would be on the menu of sacrifice? When he was walking in the cool of the day of the Garden of Eden, he knew of the anguish that would be in another garden, in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he already knew that, and yet he pursued. And you know the part of the story where God questions Adam and Eve. He gets to that point and he says, "Where are you?" Well, he knew then of a day in Jerusalem that was to come, and yet he already knew, and yet he pursued. And then he asked, "Who told you that you were naked?" And before he even asked that question, he knew of the Last Supper. He knew, and yet he pursued. And then he asked, "What is this that you have done?" And he knew then of the suffering that it would require. He already knew, and yet he pursued. When he called to man, he knew that Jesus would be abandoned. He already knew, and yet he pursued. And when he made the oceans, he knew that Jesus would weep over Lazarus and weep over Jerusalem. He already knew, and yet he pursued. And when he made the greater lights and the lesser lights, he knew of the 3 hour of darkness that would come. He already knew, and yet he pursued. And when he allowed the serpent, he knew that one day he would put him in the lake of fire. He already knew, and yet he pursued. So though God knows all of this, he proceeds, he pursues, he loves, and he sacrifices. God bothers even though he knows what it's going to require. He already knew, and yet he pursued. He knew of the redemptive history that would begin, and yet he allows us to reject him willfully. He already knew, and yet he pursued. He allows us to receive him willingly, knowing all of the end from the beginning. He still forms, he still fills the earth, he still manifests himself and becomes present. He walks in the garden knowing all of this. And I respond, I don't know if I've ever felt more loved by God. I don't know if I've ever felt more valued and more pursued. So now we know what he knew then. And knowing what he knew then, knowing that he's still pursued, what are we to do? So in conclusion, when I think about what did God know when he walked in the garden in the cool of the day? And when did he know that his son would be on the menu? And I realized that as he walked in the garden on the cool of the day, he already knew, and yet he pursued. He knew it all. He knows the end from the beginning, and yet he still forms, he still fills, he still becomes present. He walks in the Garden of Eden knowing all of this. So now we know what he knew then. And knowing what he knew, what are we going to do? My first reaction is, wow, I can't believe it. I can't believe, but I must believe how much I am loved and pursued and how much people are a priority. So Lord, today, as I think about this, I am grateful for what you did, knowing all this all the while. You already knew, and yet you went forward. You kept going. You kept saving, kept the saving plan. And I'm so thankful for all you did, despite knowing all that you knew. Thank you for saving my people. Thank you for saving me. Help us to keep in our knowledge all that you knew and when you knew it. Thank you for listening.